Acquisition, Naperville 203. Dr. Annette Acevedo, ELL Program Director, School District U46, Elgin. Margarita Vasquez, Coordinator for Second Language Learners, West Chicago, School District 33. And this panel is going to be moderated by my colleague, longtime mentor, Karen Garaby Military, who is the Senior Education Advisor at the Latino Policy Forum. Questions the panel is going to consider. In the absence of standardized test data during COVID, how have bilingual teachers collected information on student performance? How was this formative assessment data or alternative data points discussed and utilized? I know I'm wondering how these important, some of the leading practitioners in our state, how did they manage during this crazy time of COVID? In terms of the future, we have a tremendous opportunity today. We're going to be listening directly from Dr. Carmen Ayala, State Superintendent of Education, and she's going to be talking about the future of Spanish language arts, standard and assessment, and in general, what the proposed future of assessment might look like. And then after all these amazing presenters, we're going to have a chance to listen to all of you. We're going to have breakout sessions. And we have two important questions, and I want you guys to write these questions down. Keep these in mind as you're hearing the presenters today and the panel. Two key questions. How might we envision an assessment system that is fair, equitable, and instructionally useful? How can schools, districts, and the state reach this vision? We have a jam-packed agenda today. So for the sake of time, fuller presenter biographies and the agenda are attached to the event invite. I want you to please feel free to pose your questions in the chat. I actually think a lot of you, if you want, leave your chat box open so you can see the questions and the commentary. And now, without further ado, I'm going to pass things over to our first presenter today, Dr. James Pellegrino, who will be discussing student assessments since No Child Left Behind. What have we learned?
Thank you, Rebecca. I hope you can hear me. Okay, great. Thank you. I am really pleased to be given the opportunity to share with you some thoughts today and to be invited to this discussion. As the title indicates, I am supposed to be talking about what has happened with student assessment since No Child Left Behind? What have we learned? I think it's very important that we start with a certain reality that, whoops, I got to get my slides to work. Here we go. Which is the fact that, like it or not, America is obsessed with standardized testing and test scores. As a matter of fact, we invented the standardized test in 1917, and in comparison to other nations on the globe, we do more standardized testing of our students with greater frequency than anybody else. And so as you can see here, the estimate was that in 2019, the last full year when we had the regular tests, that states spent somewhere between 1.7 and $2 billion on standardized achievement tests, primarily in response to federal and state policy requirements. So how do we get here? I want to go over quickly some of the relevant chronology. I have 15 minutes to cover 20 years. Let's start it with 2002. That's when it became law. No Child Left Behind testing requirements began in 2005. In 2008 and 9, Obama was elected, and his administration called for rigorous content standards and better assessments. In 2010, we had the Common Core standards in math and ELA. In 2010, we also had the Race to the Top assessment consortia established. In 2014 and 2015, the PARC and Smarter Balance tests, which came from those consortia, were first implemented. In 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act became law. And in 2020, COVID-19 led to the suspension of state assessments. A lot has happened in between, and so we'll try to cover the terrain quickly, but some of the important features of that. So we start here With 2002, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was reauthorized, and it is known as No Child Left Behind. George Bush brought with him to the presidency a test-based accountability model that came from Texas. Many of us affectionately refer to this as the No Child Left Untested law. And what do we mean by that? Well, I think many of you probably know the key requirements, but let's just go over them and how Nclb really ratcheted up the use of standardized testing. So what it led to was annual assessments of all students in reading and math in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school, which were to begin in the academic year. And this was census testing of all students on annual state assessments aligned with state academic content and achievement standards. Science was added, but not with the same frequency, and that testing was to begin in 2007, 2008. One of the most important provisions in addition to the annual testing of all children in grades 3 through 8 was the idea of adequate yearly progress, that over a span of 12 years, 100% of students must meet or exceed what was designated a proficient level of academic achievement, and that was to occur by 2013-14, and that meant all students. And the states were to establish intermediate goals along the way. One of the key provisions, which is one of the reasons why the Democrats and Senator Ted Kennedy signed on to No Child Left Behind, was the idea that these assessments would now report in multiple categories for multiple demographic groups in terms of race, ethnicity, SES, disability, and English learner status. Their assumption in buying into this was, in addition to the tests, individuals being required to report with respect to the performance of multiple demographic groups, there would be money coming to assist. Now, that part of it, I don't believe was actually fulfilled, and much to the disappointment of the Democrats who actually signed on to the original provision. So what was the impact of Nclb on state assessment? Immediately, states started to move away from some of the innovative approaches that they had been using performance-based tasks to tests that were dominated by selected response multiple choice items. A number of trade-offs were now made in the design of those assessments, most specifically breadth versus depth of coverage. Another consequence was the narrowing in the alignment of instruction to test content and item formats. Because of the high stakes consequences of the test, we saw a lot of teaching to the test. That is, the test became the curriculum in some respects, because that's that seemingly mattered in terms of the accountability. There were increased incidents of cheating due to the high stakes consequences of assessment results. And again, this was because of the accountability uses and the required reporting. And the other piece that revealed itself very quickly was that there was large variation in state-defined expectations and standards for what defined proficient performance on state-administered tests. And generally, what this meant was that there were low absolute levels of achievement which were deemed proficient, and states could set this relative to whatever standard they want. And in large part, they had to set it low enough so that they could attempt to show increments over time in increasing towards 100% proficient. When Obama came in, he had an immediate response to some of the consequences of Nclb, and you can see it in this quote here from March 2009. Basically calling on the nation's governors and state education chiefs to develop standards and assessments that don't simply measure whether students can fill in a bubble on a test, but whether they possess 21st century skills like problem solving, critical thinking, entrepreneurship, and creativity. So what happened? In 2010, the Common Core standards came out, and they were designed to focus on college and career readiness, provide consistency of expectations from one state to the next in terms of the standards, and this idea of fewer, higher, and deeper. Now, it's really important to point out that this was an effort of the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, not the federal government per se, but we can talk about that in a minute. The other thing that happened was the federal government did provide $300 million to fund assessment consortia, the so-called Race to the Top assessment consortia, and gave them 4 years to develop high quality assessments that were aligned to these new standards and essentially the Partnership for Readiness for College and Careers and Smarter Balanced established state consortia in which across the two consortia, something on the order of 44 states were participating in one or both of these two consortia. The consortia developed assessments that were strongly in alignment with the new standards. They engaged in a rigorous assessment development and validation process. And the goal was to have common reporting across states in the consortia because they would be using the same assessment, the same scale for reporting, the same performance standards. 2015, we have Esea's successor to Nclb, the Every Student Succeeds Act. People had great expectations for how this would change things, but in fact, one of the things it did was it maintained all of the Nclb testing requirements, including census testing for 3 through 8 in high school and ELA in math and 3 times for science. It included English language proficiency testing and students with disabilities testing. What it did do was to remove the adequate yearly progress reporting on progress towards 100% proficient because it was obvious during the period between 2005 and 2013-14 that there was no hope of ever reaching the goal of 100% proficient. It also did something else which moved from test-based accountability at the federal level to state-determined accountability, where the accountability plan, model, and evidence was to be determined by each state. So each state was still responsible for accountability, but how they decided to do it and how much weight they put on test scores was up to them. It also de-emphasized one of the things that was really problematic in the Obama-Duncan era, which was a strong use of test scores for teacher accountability. So what are some key takeaway points from this? Well, what we learned is that much of what states and districts have done over this period, and they continue to do now, is driven by policy mandates such as No Child Left Behind and now the Every Student Succeeds Act. Both of those two acts have impacted the frequency and the quality of assessment, but not always for the good. The Common Core standards and the Race to the Top assessment consortia were really quite admirable state-level responses to less than desirable situations emerging from No Child Left Behind. But unfortunately, they became very politicized, and the Common Core became known as Obama Core, so that people could rail against it, and the consortia, particularly PARC, dissipated over time. Smarter Balanced is still going strong. Another thing that we can take away is that over this period of time, we've developed rigorous criteria by which we can judge the quality and validity of existing and/or new assessments. So we know a lot more now than we did at the beginning. And then assessments like those from Smarter Balanced and PARC and other recent assessment efforts really have many desirable characteristics if we look at them in terms of the features that have been designated for high quality assessments. One of the most important being alignment with rigorous standards of content and performance. So what have we learned? Let me start with the bad and the ugly. High stakes assessments can and will corrupt. There is a social science law called Campbell's Law. The forms of that corruption will take many different forms, from outright cheating to distortions of the instructional system. We've learned that we need to separate issues of assessment from issues of accountability. They are not the same thing, and oftentimes people cannot distinguish between the two and in order to see possible benefits from assessment if it's tied to uses in accountability. As much as we have wanted to find ways to talk about and measure growth, growth is a very hard thing to both conceptualize and measure when it comes to academic achievement. What we are talking about is what is in children's minds, what do they know? It is not a simple matter to create a yardstick for that like we can for other aspects of development and growth. Another thing we've learned, and that is not on the good side, is that high stakes accountability testing has actually led to a proliferation of other tests and a whole lot of expense in the educational system. In particular, districts adopted many interim assessment systems, and that their use has grown tremendously. But I hate to say that there is no empirical evidence of a positive benefit or impact of the use of those assessments on large-scale achievement outcomes. And that's true even if we look at things like not just state assessments, but the NAEP assessments, which is the national yardstick. I think the one takeaway from this, and I think it was actually something that Chuy Garcia said, was that you can't test your way to the top. When I lived in Tennessee, when I was at Vanderbilt, there's a down-home expression there: you don't fatten a pig by constantly weighing it. Now, let's talk about a little of the good. Large-scale testing has actually revealed great inequities in educational outcomes. That was an important goal and outcome of No Child Left Behind. But many have begun to wonder whether simply revealing those inequities through test scores is actually tending to proliferate or those structural inequities rather than providing solutions. So it's a standing concern now. We've also learned, and the good thing is that it's important to have rigorous content and performance standards and test against them. If you have weak standards, weak achievement levels, the consequences are not good because we fool ourselves into thinking that our students are actually making the kinds of intellectual progress that we want. The consortium has published some very nice research showing that if you have low standards for proficiency, it can be indicative of poor performance subsequently with respect to college and career readiness. We've also learned how to conceptualize, design, develop, and validate high quality assessments. And I mean that in terms of general education, as well as the assessment of English learners, as well as the assessment of special populations. So one good outcome is we've learned how to develop much better assessments that are greater quality and reflect the goals that we have for students and the needs of those populations. And I guess a takeaway here is that large-scale assessment can serve a very valuable monitoring and policy function. But let's not fool ourselves. It can't be asked to also support instruction. So where might we be going? I want to talk quickly about three contemporary considerations. First of these, and these come from efforts I've been involved in the last 3 years. In an issue of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science entitled "What Use is Educational Assessment?" We published a series of papers that promote a healthy dialogue about the purposes and uses of assessments and some of their relative strengths and limitations in the educational system. It's very important to recognize assessments need to be designed to fulfill particular purposes, and they have certain strengths and limitations, and not any single test can do all things that we want. We also have to seriously consider the comparability of assessments given varying educational and reporting goals. In 2019, with the National Academy of Education, we published a volume on comparability of large-scale assessments. And this is a very big issue because oftentimes we fool ourselves as thinking one set of results is equivalent to another set of results, when in fact they may be correlated or they may have similar correlations with something else, but they are not telling us exactly the same thing because they don't represent exactly the same things that are being measured. A great example of that is the ACT and the SAT. Yes, they are correlated. Yes, they do similar jobs of predicting freshman grade point average, but they don't measure exactly the same things. And the last is the fact that we need to work towards coordination among state, district, and classroom level assessments. That is towards balanced assessment systems. Earlier this year, the National Academy put out a report on educational assessments in the COVID-19 era and beyond. And what COVID has done and the suspension of large-scale testing has caused us to think about and reevaluate the role of large-scale testing relative to other forms of assessment. So going forward in Illinois, what are we going to be doing with respect to assessment? Well, I mean, there's many paths we can take. I think the one piece of advice is to go back to something Voltaire said: the perfect is the enemy of the good. We will never get it perfect, but let's try to work towards the good. Thank you.
Wonderful. So we have so far some questions. The first one is, has student achievement actually increased over the Nclb years?
If you, that's a interesting one to answer, because the question is on what measure. So one way to think about it is to look at the National Assessment of Educational Progress, since that is a longitudinal set of data. And in general, progress over the years on NAEP in math and ELA has been very slow. There has been growth, but it has not been anything near the kinds of rates that we would have liked to see. And when you look at the percentage of students who are deemed proficient in ELA and math at different grade levels, at grades 4 and 8, you see that we have made some progress, but not much. All the testing has not. This is why I said you can't test your way to the top.
A couple folks want you to elaborate a bit more on the need to separate issues of assessment and accountability. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you know, the reason I say to separate those is that you can do assessment and use the results of assessment for other purposes other than accountability. Accountability is you are looking for indicators or measures or metrics that you can use to keep track of whether people are actually performing up to the goals that you have in mind, right? So that they are accountable for the progress that they've made, the outcomes. Scores on assessments can be one outcome, but when we make accountability synonymous, make assessment, large-scale assessment synonymous with accountability, essentially, we are sort of limiting what goes into the accountability and who's accountable to who for what. So that's why I think, you know, you can separate. What happened in the No Child Left Behind era was that the two things were made coterminous. Accountability was fully dependent on achievement test, large-scale achievement test scores, and increases in the percentage of students who were deemed proficient.
Final question here. Is there a thinking that prior to standardized assessment, things were great for kids of color?
No. You know, there has always been some degree of indication that things were not great for kids of color, but a lot of it was hidden in the way state results and other results were reported. By reporting aggregate results or means for schools and districts, you could hide a lot of the fact that the kids who were being left behind were minority kids, the special population kids, kids with disabilities, because they represented small portions of some districts. And so that was really one of the rationales behind No Child Left Behind, which is to uncover what was happening with different demographic groups. And it established minimum N sizes within schools for reporting out in those categories. That was really, really important because it meant that you couldn't hide what was happening with the gross inequities that were happening to populations in a school district and in an individual school.
Yeah, Yeah, like English learners. Okay, I lied. I said it was the last question, but we got one more. Is this terrible? And then Elaine, you're going to be ready to go. So this last one, and then it's Friday afternoon. Okay, what is it about large scale test items that makes them difficult to use for improving day-to-day classroom instruction?
Well, it's because, well, it's not the items per se. It's how, I mean, individual items can only do so much, whether it's on a large scale test or even in a classroom assessment. And it's particularly limiting when they're just selected response type items. So in order to get really useful instructionally diagnostic information, you need more than single items or small clusters of items. And so the problem is that what's on large scale tests, the grain size of the reporting is far too coarse for the instructional needs of the classroom. And then what we tend to do then instead is we get teachers to focus on individual questions. And did kids get that right? But individual questions themselves can be very unreliable in terms of the inference you're drawing about what a kid knows. So it's not that the questions are bad or poor in many cases. It's just the limits on the information they can provide, given the goal that you have in mind, which is to actually inform instruction.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you so much for these insights. I hate to even cut it off prematurely, but we've got Dr. Elaine Allensworth here, and I want to we've got this jam-packed agenda. So Elaine, we'll pass it over. Thank you so much, Dr. Pellegrino.
Thanks, Rebecca. Can everyone see my slide? And is it the right slide? Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me to be here. I really appreciate being able to participate in this conversation. So we are at a moment, as Rebecca noted at the beginning, where the pandemic has really kind of changed the nature of standardized testing in our schools. In past years, there's been considerable amount of testing. And for some people, the absence of these tests is of great concern because it's not clear whether and how much students are learning during the pandemic and whether educators may be losing valuable information for supporting student growth. At the same time, I think for other people, the absence of testing is a welcome relief and a hope for a change in what we do in the future, given that students take a large, before the pandemic in many districts, students have been taking a very large array of standardized tests, and it's very stressful for students. It also takes a lot of time away from teaching and learning. It's not just the time for taking the tests, it's also time preparing for the tests. And so that can actually take away from, teaching and learning. So now, we really, I think, are at a point where we could be thinking differently about standardized tests. There's so many tests that students take. Again, it differs by the district, but one of the reasons there's so many different assessments is that they serve different purposes. The different assessments oftentimes are used in different ways. They have different types of questions, different types of test taking conditions, and then they're reported out in very different ways. So oftentimes they can seem very different, even if they're all tests of the same subject, for example, English and reading, language arts. But one thing we know about assessments is that even when they measure different skills in different ways, they tend to be very highly correlated with each other. So even though students are taking the different kinds of questions that are supposed to be measuring skills in different ways, once all those responses to the questions get boiled down to an actual score, the scores may actually not be very different. They're just reported out differently in different numbers or different ways of reporting. As we're thinking about, do students need to take all of these different assessments, we may want to think about what is the unique information we're getting from having students take tests over and over and over again. Okay, so I'm going to focus on these tests today. I think both, all students in Illinois take in all districts, they take the PARC, the Access, and the SAT. In Chicago, all elementary students also take the MAP. I think the MAP is used in many different districts. These are far from, these are not the only tests that students take in Chicago or pre-pandemic took in Chicago or in other places. Students take many, many other assessments in different grade levels and different subjects, and also in math and English language arts. There are other standardized tests that students in Chicago take. All of these tests are intended to measure English and reading skills, but they're used for very different purposes, and they're reported out in very different ways. So with the MAP, it's used for many different purposes. It's very convenient test to use because the test results are available very quickly, so you can use it within the same school year. It provides a reference to national norms, so you can see how students are doing relative to other students across the country. In Chicago, the typical student is performing above national norms, especially in the later grades, like in 8th grade. So students look really good on the MAP in Chicago. It's a computer adaptive test, which means that students get different questions as they're answering the test. If they start to get a lot of questions right, they'll start to get harder and harder questions. If they start to get a lot of questions wrong, they'll get easier and easier questions. And that way you don't have to waste a lot of time having students answer questions that they definitely will get right or they definitely will get wrong. And so you can really end up fine tuning the test so you can get a more precise measure of student skills quickly. Okay, and so it takes the load, the time of the test down for students quite a bit. Okay, so that's the MAP. Then of course there's the PARC, which we just heard about in terms of its development. All students in Illinois take the PARC or the revised PARC, the IAR, in 2019. As Jim mentioned, it was developed to measure or to be aligned to the college and career readiness standards that Illinois adopted, and to be aligned with the Common Core state standards. It very explicitly sets criterion scores, level 3, level 4, that are supposed to be aligned with college and career bench readiness, right? That's why it was designed, to find out, to kind of indicate whether students are meeting those readiness goals, meeting those standards. The only thing is, like, no standardized test can tell you very accurately whether students are going to be ready for college and career, right? Test performance is just one thing, one skill that matters for success in college and in career. Students need many other skills to be successful in college, and students who aren't as good in tests may be good in other, maybe have skills in other areas. And just because a student is strong in a test doesn't necessarily mean they're going to struggle if they have other skills. So in order to kind of set a criteria where students are very likely to succeed, they put those benchmarks very, very high. So for a student that's kind of average in Illinois or the country, they're not going to be meeting those benchmark standards, right? So those standards that say you're college or career ready, because those benchmarks have been set pretty high at about the 70th national percentile, right? So in Illinois, we only have 30% of students, less than 30% of students meet both the math and the ELA benchmarks, right? So students get these messages, you're not ready, you're not there yet. And they continually get those messages because the standards get harder, at each grade level. So as students, progress, the standards get harder, right? So people look at those two tests and they say, oh, only 30% of students are meeting the standards on the PARC, and we have, more than half of students, 60% of students meeting at or above norms on the MAP. And it looks like they're very different tests, right? And it looks like the PARC is a much harder test. You hear people talk about that, how it's a much harder test. And there are concerns that students maybe are being prepared for, the MAP because it's used so readily, at the expense of the skills that are tested by the PARC. And so there are all these concerns that maybe students are being prepared for one test at the expense of skills that are measured on the other. And then we have the access, which is also taken by English learners. So English learners in grades 3 through 8 are taking, English tests, English reading tests in, for the MAP, the PARC, and the access every year that they're an English learner. And the access is used to demonstrate English proficiency. There are 4, domains that are tested, including reading, writing, listening, speaking. And students will keep taking the test until they reach proficiency. And then in the high school, there's the SAT is a test that's used in the state right now. And like the PARC, it's used, students get messages, you're, meeting college benchmarks. Students who are meeting college benchmark scores, or, they get the messages that they're likely to be ready to succeed. But again, like the PARC, with the PARC, no test score can actually tell you definitively that you're ready to succeed. And so students who aren't, they put out benchmark scores that say, oh, if you're at the benchmark, you have a 75% chance of success in a college class. But they don't tell you what your success is if you're not at the benchmark. So it makes it sound like, oh, if you don't make the benchmark, you're not going to succeed. When the truth is, students who are not at the benchmark also have a good chance of succeeding in a college class. Okay, so we have all of these different tests. And so we have students taking multiple tests over, all testing reading and English language arts. And it seems like we're coming up with very different reports of how students are doing based on all these different kinds of assessments. But again, they're tested in different, students receive different kinds of questions, but when you look at the actual scores, the scores are very, very similar to each other. Okay. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview, and then I'm going to show you the data for what I'm saying. So when we look at the scores, between the MAP and the PARC, well, it seems like, maybe one test is much harder than the other. The underlying scores are pretty much interchangeable with each other, and they give basically the same prediction of future performance. So if we use either the MAP or the PARC to predict how students will do later, either in their classes or on the SAT, or on taking those tests in later years, they give pretty much the same prediction, especially in reading, less so in math. I'll talk about that in a second. Because the one difference is that the PARC is less accurate among students with very low or very high skills, especially in math. And that's, again, because it's computer adaptive, so it can adjust to students better. We also see that access scores are very highly aligned with the MAP reading scores. Again, they're, kind of, once you get, things get boiled down to a score, the scores look very similar. They're just reported out in different ways. And then, neither the PARC nor the SAT were designed for students who aren't proficient in English. And what we see is, for students who aren't meeting that 3.0 point on the access, neither test really gives us, any information on those students' reading skills. Okay, and so just here's some of the data behind that. This is a figure that, so we looked at students' 8th grade scores on the PARC and on the MAP in the reading sections. Down in the x-axis, we look at, we kind of sort students by the percentile on the test. We did this in different ways of kind of putting the two tests into the same units. This is percentiles here. And then we looked at, for students that are at a particular percentile point on either test, what's the average SAT score when they're in 11th grade? So 3 years later, right? And you would think, if the PARC is supposed to be specifically aligned to the SAT, and they talk about, the the materials in the park talks about specifically trying to be aligned to the SAT. You know, you might think, since it's designed to measure college and career readiness, that it would be a better indicator of whether students are making progress to the SAT than the MAP. But when we actually look at which, you know, how well each of the 8th grade tests predict the 11th grade scores in SAT, they look almost identical. In fact, the lines are right on top of each other, right? So, you know, one test is not better than the other test in predicting the SAT scores. MAP is a little better in terms of students with very high achievement. You can see there that little tick up at the end. Again, it's computer adapted. And in math, you see MAP is more predictive at both ends. But you know, they're virtually the same, right? Right on top of each other. Okay, so even though they're asking questions in different ways, they end up boiling down to a score that gives the same prediction. The same thing would happen, like let's say the park is trying to capture different skills consistent with the Common Core State Standards than the MAP. And so you would think that if we try to predict a student's park score using their previous year's scores, the park would be a better predictor, because the park in 3rd grade, for example, should be trying to pick up skills differently than the MAP in 3rd grade in a way that would be related to their 4th grade score. But again, when we look at how well 3rd grade MAP and 4th grade park predict 3rd grade MAP and 3rd grade park predict 4th grade park, we see something that's just very similar to this, right? Okay. When we look at the relationship between access and MAP, we do see that they're very highly correlated. That students who score, you know, have high scores in the access, that's along the horizontal axis here. On average, you know, they have higher scores on the MAP, and students who have lower scores in the access, average have lower scores on the MAP. That's true in 4th grade, that's true in 8th grade. Sorry, there's noise behind me. If we look at the subtests of the access, the strongest correlation is with the reading subtest, which is not surprising because MAP is testing reading, but the combination of access scores actually has the strongest relationship. So that's MAP. Park, we look at Park. This is 4th grade and 8th grade. If we look at students above a 3.0, we also see, you know, there's this relationship where students with stronger access scores tend to have stronger Park reading scores. But among students with scores less than a 3.0, the relationship is pretty flat, right? So Park isn't really differentiating reading skills for students with below a 3.0 on the access. And you can see that in 8th grade as well. Of course, most students in 4th grade who take the access are, you know, they're close to perfect, you know, that's the year that most students exit English learner status, right? But by the time in 8th year, when you look at English learners in 8th grade, there are many more students with scores below a 3.0. And then when we do the same thing with SAT, we see it's very flat here. So there's just, you know, once among students with scores over a 3.0, we start to see a relationship with SAT, but we don't really see a relationship below a 3.0, right? So the SAT is not really giving us information about English learners. And, you know, even though they're not designed as tests for English learners, almost all English learners in Chicago take all of these assessments. Even though they're not required to take the MAP, almost all students do take the MAP, and then they are required to take the Park and the SAT. Okay, so just a few implications. I mean, yes, they're testing in different ways and trying to get at different skills, but in the end, they boil down to a score that's just virtually interchangeable, right? All these different kinds of tests. So if you think about the amount of time students are spending preparing for the test and taking the test, is that worth, you know, all that time? Is it worth it to have scores that basically don't look any different from each other. I mean, you really could translate one scores from one test to the other. You know, Access gives you more information because you've got those 4 domains. It's designed for English learners. You could translate those scores to the MAP, the PARC, or the SAT. Students wouldn't have to be required to take all those. Of course, there are practical and political issues to consider with that. You know, the tests are not all available at the same time. They're not reported in the same way. There would definitely be some practical issues to consider. And another thing is just this idea that students are being prepared for one exam in ways that are not reflected in the other. We absolutely don't see that. We also don't see it when we look at program effects. For example, I have a study where I've looked at the effects of Common Core implementation. And I do see that teachers that are doing more standards line practices in those schools, students show larger gains on assessments, but they show larger gains on the MAP as well as larger gains on the PARC. And there's also no indication that one test is a better indication of readiness for college and career than the others. A lot of people are, you know, they're afraid to give up one test versus another because they think, oh, this is testing somewhat different skills. But the fact is, there is no standardized test that's definitive about readiness for college and career. College and career depend on many skills. Performance on tests is just one of those skills. That's it.
So I know we're short on time. I'm going to try 2 questions, and this is painful because there's like so many great questions in the chat. Is it sound educational practice to use the same exam for state accountability and to also change teacher practice and instruction, or is that a problem?
So generally you don't want to use tests for 2 different purposes, but I think it's a question of how you're using it. And are they really for different purposes? I don't think there's an easy answer to that. But yes, when you use a test for one purpose, like accountability, it will have implications for the quality of that measurement and how people perceive that assessment. And so you have to think about then how useful it is for other purposes.
Mm-hmm. And then we've got another question here that says, knowing from your presentation that MAP and PARC scores are mostly interchangeable, what's your best guess about why, on average, Chicago students score way above the 50th percentile on MAP tests, but score well below the 50th percentile on NAEP and PARC and IAR exams? To be clear, this question is about overall norms and not about the percent of students scoring at or above any particular proficiency score.
Yeah, so the way the MAP produces their norms, they produce the average for a typical school, not a typical student. And, you know, and so if you think about schools, smaller schools will be overweighted when you want to get it, like the mean of means, if that makes sense. And smaller schools tend to have lower achievement than larger schools. Larger schools and schools with higher test scores tend to attract you know, higher achieving students. And so it actually brings down the national mean on the MAP somewhat.
Yeah.
Can I just say this? If you look at the average CPS score on the NAEP or on the PARC, and you look at where CPS students are compared to the national average, look at the distribution of scores. The difference between where CPS students are and the national average is actually not that large. And when we try to project out, like what does that mean in terms of probability of success in a college class, like using the data that, you know, ACT puts out, the difference is like a 5 percentage point difference. Like, so instead of having a 70% chance of, you know, getting a C or better in a college class, it's just students would have a 65% chance of a C or better. So the differences are actually not that large. And they get smaller as students, you know, they're smaller in the older grades than the younger grades.
Yeah, no, this really a lot of thoughtful stuff. I just got a request if we could create a Q&A document following this, taking a lot of these great questions, and Elaine and Jim, I'm going to find you guys and we can maybe create like a Q&A document. And I'm not expecting you to answer this, Elaine, but all of us, I just want to read Jorge Macias's really smart comment for us to think about in the breakouts. And then Karen, you're going to be on with the panel. But he says, we have a great representation of education stakeholders today, and the topic is extremely relevant considering our state is seeking a new assessment and CPS is evaluating a new system for communicating outcomes to parents. My question is, how do we communicate the separation of assessment and accountability to parents, legislators, and policy groups? I feel the overemphasis on standardized testing will persist until we identify a viable system to communicate what school quality means to these stakeholders. So just something thoughtful to keep in mind. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Karen Garibay-Military, who herself has more than 35 years of experience in English learner education, and she'll be working with our panel.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. You know, in reflecting upon all these wonderful conversations, beginning with Representative Garcia and down to Dr. Pellegrino and Dr. Allensworth, you know, I tried to ask myself this morning if I could ever remember a time in my life that there wasn't a standardized test. Whether I was a teacher, whether I was a principal, whether I was at the state board. And I even remember as a child, the Iowa test of basic skills, you know, filling in those dots. And I used to beg my parents not to send me, not because I didn't do well on the test. You know, the report came back fine, but it was so boring. It was boring. Those were like dreaded days of school. And so, you know, I want to take the practitioner's lens because all this policy and all of these assessments, they come home to roost in the school and with the school leaders and with the teachers and the parents and the children. And so the first thing is, having been in a variety of English learner programs, not all my districts had the same goal for their English learners. Some had a strict TBE program and they wanted to get the kids into English. Others had dual language programs and they wanted children to graduate from 6th, 7th, and 8th grade fully fluent in both languages. Others of my programs were serving lots of multiple children from many, many backgrounds. So here's a key thing. Assessment, if it's going to really help us in any way, it's got to match the design of our program and our goals for our children. And too often what's happened, dual language schools in particular, really have to struggle to have enough assessments in the native language to tell whether their program is achieving that bilingual and biliteracy goal. So one of the things I'm going to ask the panelists is about their goals for their students in their districts. Also, I want to think about the time. When I was a principal in 2006, you heard Dr. Pellegrino talk about the test came in. Holy mackerel. You know, every time I had to give the MAP test, I had over 600 students. My learning center and my computer lab was closed for 2 weeks. So 3 administrations of the test, that's 6 weeks of no learning center because we had to have the kids take the test in there. And I'm reminded of one particular instance of an EL who happened to have a learning disability. He had a ton of perseverance. And I remember one day walking by the computer lab and his teacher was with him and he was still taking the MAP test, a test that was meant for 1 hour. The little boy was there for 4 hours. And when I asked him if he wanted to stop, he said, no, I don't think I should stop. I think I need to complete things. And he sat there for 4 hours. I mean, is this what we really want for children? So what I really want us to think about is that, especially that part about the fact that English assessments, be it PARC, IAR, or MAP, are not very relevant if a child is below a level 3 in their English proficiency on access. I mean, this is something serious to think about. So anyway, what I would like to do now is to actually find out, what did practitioners do when there were no assessments and that had to pause for a moment. So I'm going to turn to Dr. Anna Zuber in Chicago to see if she has any insights about things that happened in her school. And so my first question to you, Anna, is a little bit about what happened. Did you hear any reports from the schools, and what did teachers do?
So I hope you can hear me because I'm both on my phone and my computer. So one of the things, I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit too when we talked about the standardized tests and accountability, because one of the things that wasn't really said really clearly was the fact that the subgroup that we're looking at, it's great to be able to look at ELs and them not being invisible, but the subgroup we're looking at constantly changes. So we're not really able to track progress of kids who are part of the EL subgroup, because as soon as they're no longer ELs and are performing well, they're no longer part of that subgroup. And I think the work Elaine and her colleagues at the University of Chicago Consortium, when they're looking at ELs and former ELs, I think that helps address that issue a little bit. And I think with us in CPS, it's been a little bit challenging because as a district, we don't have a district-wide curriculum that's required. A lot of the decisions about the curriculum and assessments are made locally at each school. So what we've been focusing on, and this has been happening a little bit before the pandemic, so it wasn't just a response to this, was focusing on processes and kind of strategies that any school, regardless of which curriculum they're using, can find useful. So I know one of the challenges as a district, and I know personally this is my biggest pet peeve with assessments, is the assessment actually testing what we think it's testing? And this is what Karen mentioned, that if we're assessing kids in English and they're not proficient in English, we're not really testing what they know in content, we're testing their language. So the test scores that we're using for whatever decisions are not really telling us what we think they're telling us. They're really telling us that the kids don't speak English. So two of the examples I have are, one is work with the dual language schools, and I know we have a couple of our principals here on the call from our dual language schools, is really focusing on designing units and designing formative assessments for those units that align to the language of instruction. And I think like that is the greatest approach we can have, because each school makes decisions about which subject is being taught in what language, which year. And we want to make sure that if teachers are doing classroom assessments and they want to see if the kids are progressing, if they need to reteach anything, how are the kids doing, the language of assessment has to match the language of instruction. And the other kind of big lever we've been focusing on is providing training to every school across the district around understanding language proficiency and how that can be used in instruction. So for the past 2 years, we've been doing a series of modules that we present to our lead bilingual teachers, who then bring the learning back to their buildings. So starting with understanding what is language proficiency, what kids can do at each proficiency level. And if I'm a teacher, I understand what kids can do, how can I support instruction? And then we're trying to get to the point, how can I provide accommodations and supports for assessment? So then even if I'm testing in English, am I really able to test the content knowledge without language being an interference? So am I able to provide support? I guess support and accommodations, but really to remove as much of the language interference as possible. Because again, if I'm testing you in a language that you're not proficient in, the results I'm getting back are not going to tell me if you understand the content. And that's, as a teacher, that's what I need to know, because that's what I need to focus on in the classroom. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna. That's so informative. And I do know CPS has a variety of dual language schools and other models. So I'm going to now turn to Annette Acevedo, who happens to be from Elgin, one of the second largest districts in the state. And so Annette, tell us first about the goal you have for your students in Elgin, and then a little bit about what teachers did during the pandemic.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. So in U46 in Elgin, as many of you know, we're the second largest district after Chicago. And so, we have over 9,600 active ELs. And what our goal for the majority of those students who happen to have Spanish as the home language background is, you know, how we serve them is through a dual language model. And so our goal is, of course, besides high academic achievement in you know, for all students, it would be bilingualism and biliteracy. So that is what makes, you know, our program a little different in terms of the TBE umbrella, because we, you know, our focus is dual language. And so it's that bilingualism and biliteracy piece. And even with our students who are not in the dual language program, so we have TPI students or ESL students, we definitely still, even though that goal might be, you know, look different, it's not biliteracy or bilingualism per se, we still make sure that you know, the value of the home language is really important. And so for instance, in one of our schools where we have a high incidence language of Polish, Gujarati, Urdu, Tagalog, it's still bringing in and making sure we have those resource teachers support and show value for that home language. So we have resource teachers in those languages. In terms of what our teachers have done, we've been really fortunate, I think, because we've had dual language programming for several years now, since 11-12, and we've implemented a grade every year since then. We have a pretty robust assessment system that we have an assessment and accountability office that we work really closely with. And so we've always been at the forefront. We've always considered testing in both languages. So when we do assessments, making sure that we have assessments in both languages. And we've continued to do that during this time. Our format, you know, we really make sure, kind of like what Anna said, that our language of assessments, you know, match our language of instruction when we're talking about our formative assessments and our common assessments. And as a matter of fact, we've been having a lot of conversations about that even this year, as we continue to just look at you know, that biliteracy piece with students, and the importance of taking and ensuring that a student's entire kind of linguistic repertoire is taken into account when we're assessing them. And as others have said here, that we're not you know, that we're making sure that we're assessing what we're intending to assess, and you know, and that we understand what our assessments are trying to get at. So that's, you know, I think we've been really fortunate in that sense, because we have had we work really closely with our assessment office and with our other content coordinators to make sure, and our other directors, to make sure that we have a balance of assessments, and not just a balance of assessments in terms of language, but in terms of standardized versus formative assessments and common assessments that are created by teachers. So that is something that we have done. In terms of, you know, teachers have been creative, I think, like all districts, in making sure that they're obviously, when they're assessing students now, it's been all about integrating technology, right? And so how they've integrated technology into their practices, and using different engagement tools. And I think I think that's probably common across all districts, right? Is that we've used every resource and tool possible to assess students in different ways. It's not just paper pencil anymore. Ways that not only can students kind of receive immediate feedback, but teachers can also provide immediate feedback. And I think that's been one of the pluses. But I think another thing that I'd just like to add as well, that has definitely been a plus in this environment in terms of looking at data. It's not innovative per se, but I think it's very critical, is that we've really been taking a look at the disaggregated achievement data and discussing it with our teams, our MTSS teams, and also looking at, you know, this pandemic has really forced us to be intentional and hyper focused on other data. So attendance data, SEL data, you know, just access data in terms that tells us access to technology and, you know, internet. So I think it's really forced us to come together and problem solve in unique ways that we wouldn't have, you know, had to do before. So it's allowed us to create better systems. So that's one of the pluses, I would say, that when we're looking at all of this data and kind of innovative ways, we've had to do things that we probably wouldn't have done before, that we should have done before, but we weren't doing because we weren't forced to do. And now we have been forced to do it. And I think that's great.
So Annette, a quick question for you. Those assessments in Spanish that you mentioned, were those actually written by teachers in your district?
So yes, our formative common assessments, yes.
Okay. Okay, great. Great. And I'm so glad you mentioned attendance. You know, attendance as an indicator in these times is super important too.
Yes, we had, and she's in the room, Dr. Usman Shah was part of helping create this attendance cycle that we did. And we were once again very hyper focused on that and looking at, what is this data telling us, and who isn't coming to school and why are they not coming to school, right? Why, and really getting to that why, and everybody coming together and really having to address that.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. That's awesome. So now what I'd like to do is turn to Margarita Vasquez from West Chicago. And West Chicago is near and dear to my heart. I worked there twice. And so Margarita, can you first tell us a little bit about your goals for your students? Like what are you trying to achieve in West Chicago?
Sure, our goals are very similar to U46 with what Annette was talking about. Our program is a dual language program, Spanish and English. And so our goals are bilingual, biliterate, and bicultural. So that's the majority of our population in West Chicago. And we also have a small population of TPI ESL students, very similar to U46. So those are our goals. And we're always striving to uplift the Spanish language within our community, within our parents, and also within our teachers, and promoting those assessments especially in literacy, so that we can see the student holistically overall. So when we're in kindergarten, we can start teaching both languages, Spanish and English, from a very early start, and then just keep promoting it all the way through 8th grade. So those are our biggest goals, and how we do that is through conferencing with teachers are conferencing with the students in both languages, and that is just such powerful work for the teachers to do with the students so they can uplift the languages, and the students really feel more comfortable in knowing 2 languages and knowing the superpower that it truly really is in connecting them, and also moving them into higher levels of English and academic language overall in both languages.
Wow. So a question for you, Margarita, over time, like with your emphasis on the 2 languages and elevating both, have you seen some gains on those mandated large scale assessments that you have to give? Have you seen any changes? Okay.
We have seen gains. And like it was stated before, more in the 4th grade, 5th grade level, we see more students exiting the access with a 4.8. And also we're seeing those scores go up a little bit more, especially by 8th grade when they stay in the dual language program. They're off the charts in 8th grade. So we're working on that so it's comparable in both languages and not just in one language. We have yet to start the MAP Spanish, but we're hoping to get that going by next school year and really get to see how the students do equally in both languages.
Okay. And then Dr. Marian Freebus-Flaman is from Naperville, District 203. And so Marian, can you tell us a little bit about your goals for your students in 203?
Sure. Our program, similar to others before me, for TBE, we primarily use the dual language program, ours is 2-way immersion, but about half of our English learners are speakers of other languages at home. And so kind of going to what you were saying, Karen, about different models, right, even within the same district. But as far as our goal, really our goal for English learners aligns very much with our goal for all students, which is in our mission statement, which is for students to be self-directed learners, collaborative workers, complex thinkers, quality producers, community contributors. If you think about that list, this is something that all of our English learners can do, and in multiple languages and across multiple cultures, right? So that's really our goal, is for our students to be able to do that. And again, with our TBE programs, we can definitely support them becoming bilingual, bicultural, and biliterate. But we also do what we can to try to support the other languages by, first of all, making sure that the students know that, they are special for being bilingual, right? We think of multilingual learners as a superpower, as Margarita said. And so, our goal is truly for them to develop not only in their home language, but not only in English, but also in their home language. And we promote the seal of biliteracy in that way. We do offer the seal of biliteracy in any home language. And we feel that it is up to us to find a way to assess the proficiency in those languages where perhaps there isn't a standardized assessment yet. With regard to what our teachers have been doing, we have, since the beginning of our program, we have measured the reading proficiency in English and in Spanish using the Fountas and Pinel. And the teachers were able to do that even with the remote learning, because it is very much like having the student read something and then listening to them, asking comprehensive questions. So they were able to do that. And then over the course of the year, we have been able to bring some students in for the MAP, and we do give the Spanish MAP test now. This is, we just started doing that. So we do try to balance the languages of assessment, but this year being a unique year, I think the teachers really are relying mostly on their formative assessments and authentic assessments that they've developed. And I have to say that, silver lining, very much like what Annette was saying, is things that we've been forced to do that we hadn't been doing up until now, right? So there's an increased level of collaboration between teachers. So now we have, resource teachers working much more closely with the classroom teachers to really look at students' work and using some of really just authentic assessment, looking at the student work as a form of a pretest, and then doing the instruction, and then looking at, again, the students' work as a form of post-test, really trying to integrate not just any quizzes or assessments that the teachers make, but also looking at the authentic student work. During the remote learning, we saw teachers use a lot of the apps and extensions like Seesaw, Flipgrid, Pear Deck, all of these various ways that they could engage students in the, assessment for learning is the way that they were looking at it. There was also a little bit of a concern that, students might not always be doing their best work, right? And so, even just having students like in those one-on-one conferences that Margarita talked about, a lot of times teachers would set up individual Zoom rooms and meet with students so that they could have those conversations. And now that we have a lot of our students physically in school for in-person instruction, those have continued, and we hope that these practices of more authentic assessment of students' work and their actual achievement and proficiency levels in the context of what they're doing will continue.
Thank you so much to our panel. Just a few closing words. I'm going to is that for some of you know that I was teaching the last 3 years in Spain, and when the pandemic hit, I was amazed at the depth of the curriculum. Over there, students were doing Socratic circles in 5th grade. During the pandemic, they were uploading authentic work, and the teacher was creating rooms where they would discuss the work, that the children were doing just during the pandemic, kind of virtually. So what I will say is that this is a worldwide issue, so we're here talking about it in Illinois and in the United States, but it's a worldwide issue. And so there's one person that I know that has been in this as long as I have, and she's been on the ground and she's held so many leadership roles. And that's our distinguished State Superintendent, Carmen Ayala, Dr. Ayala. So she's here now to share with us some ideas about the possible future of assessment in Illinois. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Ayala.
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon, everyone. I see so many individuals that I've known for many years that have been in the trenches addressing some of these. And, thank you to Dr. Pellegrino, because he took me back in time with the history of the assessments. I remember IGAP and ISAT and, everything that came after that. I also remember, and Karen, you could probably remember the specific years and stuff. You know, when we had different entry and exit criteria for English language services in the state, and some districts used IPT and other districts used LOS and some other districts used the solemn. And kids were moving across, you know, districts across the state, and their language proficiency was here in this district, but when they went to this district and got assessed, oh my God, no, they don't have this language. And so then, you know, there was U.S. Department of Ed guidance on that, which said we have to have common entry and exit procedures. And then, you know, access followed. And then we had the language, you know, the English language proficiency standards and all of that. So definitely an evolution with assessments, and No Child Left Behind for me cracked it open, because previous to No Child Left Behind, many of our groups of students were buried in the average. Average test scores in this district, you know, 75% of our students are meeting our expectations. But when you peeled away the different groups, it was a different story. So that's one thing I got excited about with Nclb. The other stuff, I'm not so sure I'm with some of it. You know, and Esea came along and kind of, you know, removed some of the stuff that we knew wasn't necessarily good. But nevertheless, here we are, 2021, and we still have a U.S. Department of Ed requirement to administer a common assessment across the entire state that is the same for all 3rd through 8th graders in reading and math, and then once in high school. So you're probably asking, well, let's not give it. What would happen if we just didn't give it? You could say goodbye to your Title I, Title II, Title III, Title IV, federally funded IDEA, and all of the different funding sources that we receive from the federal, from the U.S. Department of Ed, the federal government. That's how intricately it is tied in. We recently received, or will be receiving, a total of $7.8 billion in pandemic relief funds. I would think that the legislators, the public, would want to know how effectively that resource, that is an unprecedented amount of money that is going into public education, how effectively are those resources being used? And is the impact of the pandemic on our students being addressed? And you know, okay, so we have to use our tests to be able to show impact and monitor that. So, you know, I was one of those, having been a teacher, school administrator, central office, district superintendent. I was one of those voices screaming about, how can we give our EL students this test that's in English when all it's going to tell you is what we already know? They don't have enough English to tell you what they know and can be able to do, right? I'm sure some of you remember the meetings that I sat in that I almost made that same exact statement. So here's an attempt to try to address a part of the problem, or a part of the challenge that we have. Illinois had Spanish language arts standards many years ago, but those standards didn't go through the full process of adoption. We do have, and I'm glad to see Francella on the screen, because Francella was one of the co-facilitators of a statewide group that came together, and I think some of you here on the screen are also a part of that group, to put together new Spanish language arts standards for the state of Illinois. And those standards have been completed. They're in public comment and moving forward for approval and to become formally adopted for the state of Illinois. I'll share a little experience as an assistant superintendent in a district. This is why standards are important. They form the foundation, the vertical and horizontal articulation that has to occur. That's what curriculum comes from. The standards is not the curriculum. The standards get unpacked to then develop curriculum. So was in a district that was going through extreme growth and lots of attendance boundary changes. In one school, they taught the dinosaur unit in first grade. Child had to move to the new school because the boundaries shifted. Second grade, he got the dinosaur unit again. Well, they had to move again because of the rapid growth. Went to another school in third grade. Guess what unit he got again? The dinosaur unit. So standards help to bring about a structure, a framework, the vertical and horizontal articulation. And then obviously, if we have to have a standardized assessment, it should be deeply aligned to those standards. And so that's why the Spanish language arts standards. First, that's the skeleton, right? Standards, that's the plate. And now we can build a Spanish language arts assessment to assess those standards, and that we would have a common way of taking a look at how well our students are doing, and to advocate to the U.S. Department of Ed that our English learners that are at this level of English proficiency ought to be able to take, it's an equity issue, they ought to be able to take an assessment that truly shows what they know and can be able to do. And that we have the accommodations for when they're transitioning. And then at some point, we might want to have them have the English assessment, but that the Spanish and the English assessments, like the standards have been developed, are comparable. Because if you learn how to find the main idea in your native language, we all know that just transfers over. You don't need to learn that all over again in English. Remember Eleanor Thonis? Her stuff was good. But then we know there are those negative transfer kinds of things, right? Subject, verb, some of the, contractions don't exist in Spanish. So those are the unique language kinds of things that we want to make sure we're teaching for Spanish language reading, literacy, proficiency, but then also those non-transferable kinds of things that our students need for English proficiency. And so the Spanish language arts standards are written side by side with the English language arts standards, but yet they include the uniqueness of the Spanish language arts that is not included in English language arts. The assessment that we are moving towards, and I'll speak a little bit to that, is an improved state assessment to potentially replace the current Illinois Assessment of Readiness. So that assessment would be, and obviously we have to get U.S. Department of Ed approval throughout this whole process, that assessment, that 8 or 9 hours worth of testing on all the prep work that you all talked about for this state assessment that you give in the spring, and then you don't get results until maybe July, August, and full final results when the report card comes out, that would be eliminated. And I heard a lot of conversation about these fall, winter, spring assessments, and those kinds of things. So what if the state were to have as its required state assessment a fall, winter, spring assessment deeply aligned to the Spanish language arts, a test in Spanish, and then the English language arts assessment from kindergarten through 8th grade, but for accountability purpose, we would only use 3rd grade through 8th grade because that's what we have to do. And the assessments, the time would be reduced. The results would be almost immediate. Schools, classrooms, teachers would have more control over the results of those assessments, because you would know right from the get-go in the fall, oh my God, here's where my kids are. I got to focus here, here, and here, versus you only get one shot in the spring, and that's how you're going to get your designation. Well, now I have 3 opportunities to gauge my instruction, to make adjustments, to put in interventions, to look at resources, so that I can have better control of what that designation might be at the end, because we're not going to get away from the designations. We have to work with it unless the U.S. Department does a complete 180. They see the value of the assessments, and somebody said it here also, the community wants to know, well, what's the quality of education in our schools? Now, why don't we just have teachers develop their own formative assessments, and it's tightly aligned to the teaching and learning in the classroom? Well, then we're going to go back to that example I gave you with our entry and exit criteria that we had many, many years ago. You can't get, you know, policy level, system-wide kinds of information from assessments like that. And so our goal is to have an assessment that is given when fall, winter, spring, completely aligned to our Illinois learning standards, fast results. It would save the district some resources because this would be state funded, and it would include districts having the opportunity to give the K-1-2. So then you have a full longitudinal way to measure where your students are going, K-8. So that's my story, and that's what I'm kind of sticking to right now. That's the goal. That's what we're working towards. We are working with our State Assessment Review Committee and our Technical Assistance Council as well. And we'll be bringing forward, requesting an RFSP to be put forward so that we can begin to find how this assessment will be developed, implemented, and become the new improved state assessment. Now, this isn't going to happen overnight. So this year would be the RFSP and the vendor application and the review, and there's a whole procurement process that we have to follow. So this year and part of next school year would be that process. The beginning of the development would be 21-22, continuing 22-23 with some possible piloting then. 23-24, we have to pilot, and we have to show, apply and show to the U.S. Department of Ed that this new improved assessment meets the criteria like our current IAR assessment does, and get their approval. And then we would be ready for full implementation 24-25, más o menos. So it's a process to put in a new assessment at the state level that we're required to have. So I want to thank, Latino Policy Forum, Karen, Rebecca, Sylvia, for this opportunity to just come on in and give an update on where we are. I'm really excited about this. And not only that, but to listen to Dr. Pellegrino and Allensworth and everyone that has talked here, Annette from Elgin, and everyone that I've worked with in the past before. So again, it's good to see everyone, but thank you for the opportunity to share, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if that's where you want to take this next, Karen.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions in the chat. Carmen, what would this mean for access?
This does not replace access, because USDE requirement, we have to test language proficiency separately from academic reading and math.
Another question, did Illinois consider using the Smarter Balanced Assessment System instead of going this route?
We're working with our state advisory, state assessment advisory committee. We're going to be looking at, first of all, what is our vision? What is the vision? And I kind of explained some of it to you. And then you formulate from your vision and the things that you are wanting, you formulate an RSFP. You know, I don't want us to just adopt something else that's out there. If we know this is what we would like, that would be adding another assessment. Well, one of the goals that we have is to reduce. I mean, I've heard it from parents, I've heard it from teachers, I've heard it from administrators. I said it myself. I think there is great interest in finding ways to reduce the amount of testing that is occurring. And I heard it this afternoon.
Yeah, it definitely came up in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions from the audience? I'm not seeing a lot of questions. Here, could this new system work for para, the teacher evaluation requirements?
That would be something that would have to be addressed and discussed. Every single district has a joint committee, and that the joint committee is the one that determines what and how assessments will be used for teacher evaluation. So that remains, that won't change.
We have another question. I see the benefit for assessing in both English and Spanish. Are there any considerations for these assessments to take into account what students are transferring from one language to another?
We'd have to take a look at that. You know, I've always talked about a continuum of assessments for our English learners, and that middle piece when they're kind of negotiating both languages, we would have to figure out that particular piece of it.
Really insightful. If any other last questions here from the audience, since we've got Dr. Ayala here. I'm not seeing them. Oh, here.
And wowed them.
I know I love it. It's Friday. We are wowed. Thank you for big thinking. Given the timeline, what might be the opportunity to intersect our new ISB assessment with competency-based pilots that are going on? Also, how can we think about family communication, partnership on the front end of the development process?
Well, as I said, we do have an assessment, state assessment review committee, and that is representative of individuals from across the state. And we do have a technical advisory because there's some real technicalities that I even wasn't aware of with regards to assessments and developing an RFSP and those kinds of things. Professional development is going to be something that has to be very high priority on whatever happens with the state assessment in the future. And so I think, and when I say professional development, you know, that's inclusive of parents as well. You know, we did some work with the other assessments when they came on board, and that's fine. But I think that there are some things, some lessons that we learned and that we could do different in terms of what we can provide for parents, especially if we're looking at a Spanish language arts assessment and really working with our parents to even understand what is an assessment and why do we do that? Why do we do it?
Yeah, yeah. This is, I know you've done a really great job of outlining, obviously, a first step forward with Spanish language arts assessment, which is huge. So, you know, the follow-up question are going to be, you know, considerations for ELs who speak other languages, which I know you've thought about.
Yeah, we had to start somewhere, and there's only so much you have to work with, ching ching. So, you know, over 70% of our EL population is Spanish speaking. And so that's why we went first with the Spanish native language assessment. We do have to take a look at the English language arts assessment and make sure that there are the appropriate accommodations and access for those speakers of other languages. And in there, Rebecca, is where we may be able to get at that messy time when there's two languages going on for our English learners.
Yeah, that translanguaging. I'll leave with another question too. That's, and I know you've thought about this a ton in the years I've known you. If there's a possibility for a quick turnaround on this new assessment, are there possibilities for a quicker turnaround on access?
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting question. And I know we've been in discussions about this before.
Yeah. I mean, wherever I could do anything in that regard, but let's take one step at a time. I think the bigger piece would have been the language arts and math assessment. And then I think we can begin to then move into the language proficiency assessment, because access has been around over 10 years, I want to say.
Yeah.
More. And so it's time that we take a look at revisions or adjustments or other things that we know might be available.
Yeah, yeah. Jorge's asking one other question, and I said the last one was the last one. I'm being terrible at moderating. I did that to Jim too. How do we communicate to stakeholders, especially parents, that these assessments will not be the only way to measure school quality?
Well, that's one of the strategies in the agency's strategic plan is a piece on assessment literacy. And we are developing modules to begin to address assessment literacy. What does this mean? And those modules will also be modified for parents, because I think it has to do with understanding and information. I don't know really how the teacher preparation programs are working today, but I don't know that there is a teacher preparation program that teaches you the deep alignment between curriculum, standards, assessment, materials, and instruction. I don't know that we have I don't know that the majority of our teachers would understand that when the standard says, or when the objective in the curriculum says, students will be able to compare and contrast, blah, 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 blah. And then you look at the assessment and they're identifying. So that there is a lack of an alignment between the verb in the curriculum and how it's assessed. And so that's what I mean by assessment, professional development and assessment literacy. How do you interpret? How do you measure? How do you look at the results? And then there's another piece that would be more appropriate for parents to understand.
Yeah. No, wonderful. This has been so insightful. And I know I squeezed in so many questions. I promise we're going to follow up with a recording. Eulalia gave me some homework. She wants a Q&A document. We were planning on writing a report of the reflections of what was covered today and sending it out to folks. And just most of all, we just deserve 2 hours to stop and pause and talk about English learners. I'm just so honored that you're all here, and have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Thanks so much. Appreciate everyone being here.